Good morning and welcome to Session 1, Surrealist Encounters in the New World, Pre-Columbian and Northwest Coast Art. Our first speaker today is Rita Eder. Before bringing her back to the stage, I wanted to say just a few words of introduction. Rita Eder is a professor in the Graduate Art History program at UNAM, the Universidad Nacional, Autónoma de México. She has been director of the Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas at UNAM and visiting professor at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, the University of British Columbia, and the École des Hautes Études in Paris. She specializes in modern and contemporary art of Mexico and Latin America and has published extensively on the subject. Her paper today is entitled Benjamin Péret and Paul Westheim, Surrealism and Other Genealogies in the Land of the Aztecs.
Well, good morning again. Well, Rebecca has already said what the title of my paper is. And it is divided in a series of parts. So the first one is called Benjamin Péret and Paul Westheim's Arrival in Mexico. Art and Ethnography Inside and Outside Surrealism. On the 16th of December, 1941, Benjamin Péret and Remedios Varo disembarked in the port of Veracruz. After a month-long journey on a Portuguese boat, the Serpa Pinto, which according to its records had made over 20 trips during the height of the war and saved many lives. That same day, German art critic alighted from the same ocean liner. They both came from Marseille, and I suspect they obtained their visas thanks to Gilberto Bosques, the Mexican general consul who risked his life giving papers of entry to Jews, leftist militants, and those with other affiliations prohibited by the collaborationist government. This section of the text analyzes and compares two different perspectives on pre-Hispanic art. Péret, who came from the ranks of Breton Surrealism, inserts the marvelous and the strange into the aesthetic discussion, and some of the most powerful paragraphs in Péret's work concerns human sacrifices within the framework of domination and despotism through terror and hero worship, a form of reflecting on war and the political system that had cast a shadow over his life, marked by 2 world wars and his militancy in the Spanish Civil War. Conversely, his work on myth as a universal origin encourages one to think about their meaning as alternative poetic interpretations in relation to the notion of history. Westheim, on the other hand, wrote 2 seminal works on pre-Columbian art, Ancient Art of Mexico, 1950, and Fundamental Ideas of Pre-Hispanic Art, with similar concerns on the destabilization of the dominant aesthetics put forward by Boehringer and Carl Einstein. I will say a few words about these 2 men. The encounter between Surrealists and other kindred spirits with pre-Hispanic art is rooted in a theoretical turn confronting European colonialism that took shape in the aesthetic appraisal of objects from Africa and Oceania around the first decade of the 20th century. This process involved breaking away from evolutionism and considering the relations between art and religion of the so-called primitive societies that gave rise to a different and complex artistic conception. In recent decades, the earliest lucid steps regarding the issue have been attributed to Carl Einstein and his 1915 essay on black sculpture, Neger Plastique, a diatribe against the Eurocentric art history of his time and a position statement. Writing about the sculpture of so-called primitive people does not mean legitimizing or expanding the repertoire of Western art, but rather revealing its formal structure. which by its very qualities has an impact in shattering the still dominant classical conception. His fracture with classical aesthetics is related to Wilhelm Boringer's essay, Abstraction and Empathy. That would have an impact, as we shall see, on the reflection and writing on pre-Columbian aesthetics. Einstein, affiliated with Document, a seminal journal in the story of Surrealism, has been integrated as an alternative perspective of the Surrealism ethnography episode. When he wrote on Coatlicue, Westheim defined her as a construction that could be analyzed through some aspects of Breton's surrealist imagination, bringing together issues that are of interest to the surrealist ethnography debate. Aire de México, which means air of Mexico. Péret stayed in Mexico for a period of just over 6 years, was far from happy. Judging from the letters he wrote on his arrival, in which he said, "I feel as though I were on an island in the middle of the Atlantic. There is no one here. I hope that one day, when this bad joke is over, we can all meet up in an inhabitable city. For the time being, we are bored to death." When he returned to France in 1948, his negativity persisted, as is clear from his answers to an interview in which he declared, "What did I do in Mexico? I got very bored. Mexico is a country that is only interested in Mexico. Everything is a tradition, but a totally formal tradition, devoid of all life." Péret also thought that Mexico was a politically backward country because of the submission of its people. But nevertheless, he wrote a beautiful text about Mexico in Paris in 1951, entitled precisely Aire de México, that air that had so asphyxiated him while he lived there. During his stay, he wrote several texts approaching pre-Columbian art from an aesthetic and political point of view. A brief introduction. Okay, good. A brief introduction. Let me see, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, I won't say a brief introduction again, but written in 1943 to the photographs of Manuel Álvarez Bravo, taken in the Aztec Hall of Sculpture of the National Museum, was probably his first approach. This album was a small, very small, modest edition with rather dark reproductions. A glance at the images shows that the hall also contained, well, that is very Aztec, and you recognize her very well, but it also contained pieces from other cultures, giving us an idea of the erratic state of classification of the collection. This was, of course, Veracruz, and the former had to do with Teotihuacan, including the sculptures of Tula, Teotihuacan, and Veracruz under the generic heading of Aztec. Not only reveals problems of classification, but is coherent with Mexico City, the old Aztec seat of power, as a centralist political structure. So here, I think there is a relationship between this kind of classification and a concept of power. Péret wrote the text from a comparative perspective. The Mayas are the Greeks, while the Aztecs show affinities with Egyptian art. However, the problem is always human sacrifices lend such a tragic accent, says Péret, to Aztec art and civilization. This pathetic sense leaves a unique mark on sculpture, giving its representations of death an unparalleled feeling of horror and fear. His judgment on the Aztec horror and violence is followed by his diatribe over the Western barbarity that had forced him to flee. Due to the war, said Péret, Western civilization has not progressed much since the time of the Aztecs, except in the art of killing and lying. At least the Aztecs, as a nation, participated as a group in artistic creation. Notes on pre-Columbian art. A subsequent text published in the journal Horizon in 1947 includes questions of the evolution of cultures in which he links his own studies on the universality of myths. There are very few characters in Greek-Latin mythology, said Péret, that do not have their equivalent in the Mexican or Mayan Olympus. For this reason, it was soon concluded, this is by Péret, that America had links with Europe at different times, either through St. Thomas, are very well, not Thomas Getkens, but St. Thomas, identified by the Catholic priests with Quetzalcoatl, and his appearance is due to the supposed existence of Atlantis. There is no time, I'm sorry, to explore the broad and fascinating debate on the American origins in Atlantis that would last well into the 19th century. What is striking here is that Péret was acquainted with Paul Rivet, who was indeed close to the ethnographical discussion in Paris, as director both of the Trocadero. His book on the multiracial origins of the American continent via the Bering Strait and the Pacific Ocean. And there is proof in the memoirs of Octavio Paz that they frequented each other, and yet in a way he preferred the extraordinary fantasy of Atlantis, whose lost lands would be reincarnated in the Maya area. Péret experienced a change of attitude towards the Maya culture when he decided to travel to the southeast and write Discovery of Chichen Itza. He traveled on an old bus surrounded by turkeys, pigs, and buckets of ice that melted at the feet of the Indians huddling together, dressed in white. The bus drove through green scenery full of agaves that turned into mule tracks and millions of butterflies. Okay. It is difficult, really difficult, to transmit the beauty and accuracy of this text that focuses on the pyramid known as the castle, described in detail as the symbolic structure of time, which leaves nothing to chance. As in nearly all texts, sacrifices are crucial issues, and in front of the temple of the jaguars, he imagines the offering of a solar divinity of the beating heart of a victim painted in blue. This is just a detail. A priest had decapitated to place the head on one of the spikes comprising the tzompantli, the place of the skulls. It is a platform measuring 2 meters high, surrounded by a wall, decorated entirely with the skulls, producing an extremely lugubrious effect. In comparison, the dance macabre of the Middle Ages seemed like a diabolical joke. Péret examines the feelings ranging from oppression to surprise that the sight of the tzompantli causes him. Death in that world, and even in the present-day lives of the Mayas, says Péret, must have been omnipresent and horrific, and yet an object of delight for artists who managed to achieve such macabre intensity. What counts in aesthetic terms for Péret is the emotion or feeling of strangeness that increases the further away it is from the object of classical art. The strangeness, according to Péret, and this is literal from his text, is literally the visible content, whereas its hidden content would be related to a repressed childhood memory that the sight of the object had revived in the semi-obscurity of the unconscious. Freud's unheimlich, or uncanny, so clearly described in this text of Péret as a principle of another aesthetic emotion, has been a central aspect that Hal Foster addressed in his book, Compulsive Beauty, a postmodern reinterpretation of surrealism. The uncanny, says Foster, is a concern with repressed materials that return to disrupt the unitary identity, aesthetic norms, or the social order. And it appears as crucial to the works and notions of the surrealist as the marvelous, convulsive beauty, and objective chance. There is in this paper a whole discussion of how actually the surrealists approached the concept of the uncanny, whether they had the text accessible or not. But basically, what would seem important from Péret, not only the uncanny, but the dialectic, the Freudian dialectic of the principles of pleasure and death, present in those Aztec gods that both repelled and attracted him because of their artistic value and expressiveness. Péret's texts bear the stamp of political analysis when they explore the grandiose in art with the aim of mythical poetry and the emergence of the celebratory power of their heroes and divinization. This marks the start of a new cycle, a heroic cycle in which Péret observes signs of the contemporary revival in the worship of false heroes such as Hitler and Stalin. The submission of the conquered, thought Péret, encouraged the emergence of hero worship that rapidly achieved its peak and was expressed in art with a tendency towards the sublime. During this period, fear and horror totally dominated the pre-Columbian religions that involved bloodthirsty ceremonies, in keeping with the warrior custom of the tribes that had established this form of worship. This point of view of Péret emerges, I would say, almost 30 years later, in a very important text by Octavio Paz, The Criticism of the Pyramid, which we don't have enough time to go in. But we will go into some kind of response in Mexico to this situation so well described and felt by Péret. The next little part of my paper is called Cinema, Crime in the Museum. These are old pictures of the National Museum for you to get an idea of what it looked like even in times of the film I'm going to describe. The National Museum played a key role as an image of the pre-Hispanic world for those who toured its halls, probably in a state of surprise, perhaps awe and also confusion. It housed enormous stones, and its dark, mysterious atmosphere made it ideal for novels and the cinema, in which certain Gothic fantasies and the aesthetic values that had already been attributed to Aztec art, such as terror and monstrosity, could be recreated. It was in the cinema that an ironic perspective on anthropological studies, which contained desire to return to the Aztecs and perhaps of the practice of human sacrifices, emerged. This is just to give you an idea of how the room looked and, of course, of the size of the sculptures. Okay. In 1939, a Mexican movie maker, Chano Urueta, directed two films, The Sign of Death and Night of the Maya, on the subject of mythical survival of pre-Hispanic culture in the imaginary of modern Mexico. The Sign of Death can be defined as a parody with a Gothic atmosphere. The main action takes place in two settings in the National Museum, which you have just seen. These two spaces inserted in the surface basement, day-night, conscious-subconscious dialectic are, on the one hand, the main hall on Aztec sculpture known as the Monoliths Hall, located, I think, well, that's the Monolith Hall, also called the Aztec Sculpture Room, located at the top of the building, and on the other, also the other space, the dark, intricate basements of the old museum that housed a variety of collections until 1964, when the current Museum of Anthropology was opened. The film creates the atmosphere of a desire for the pre-Hispanic past, with the image of a zoomorphic container in which the heart and bloods of the sacrificial victim were placed, followed by a text taken from the Xilitla Codex. Okay, I hope I'm going to say more or less what it says. It is a codex that actually exists, and it predicts the coming back of the son of Quetzalcoatl, and it also, this coming back to restore the pre-Columbian past has as its main condition sacrifice of young maidens. Okay. So, and the funny part is that you go first from these pictures of the pre-Columbian past, very serious and solemn in a way, the prediction of the coming back of Quetzalcoatl, and suddenly you find yourself in this scenery where, I'm sorry, my voice is going opposite. I'm sorry. Opposite the enormous stone known as the Aztec Calendar, there is Cantinflas inside the National Museum. At the base of the wall, supporting this enormous sculpture, stands comic actor Cantinflas in the role of a museum guide. The hall with pre-Hispanic monumental sculptures looks rather labyrinthic. The foreign visitors who are beginning a tour of the museum, this is like a tradition to put Porfirio Diaz also under the, this is a photographic tradition, I don't have too much time to describe it. But anyway, it's just 1 second of, this is how the guided visit came about.
Ídolo, como quien dice, ideología de idolatrar, idolatro, ídolo, nos idolatramos. Muy bien, este ídolo tuvo en su época 1000 años, porque vivió 2000, aparte de 1000 todavía son 3000. Según los datos que yo he tomado, porque ya estudiado, no pensé que nomás vengo así, yo ya vengo de otro modo. He tomado, según los datos que tengo aquí, data el caso según aquí pasa la página 23, y ya se me perdió. Bueno, no importa, lo importante es que este se hizo. Oh, yo adoro este ídolo. Pues sí, ya es cuestión de gusto, ¿verdad? Yo en un momento vengo a verlo con más frecuencia y me quite, ¿verdad? Ahora les voy a enseñar otra cosa más interesante que tengo en mis estudios. Vamos.
Anyway, so as you see, the foreign visitors are being given a tour of the museum, and they look on rather sort of distantly and amused, while Cantinflas explains in a magnificent jumble of nonsense intended to make fun of shrewd interpretations of the meaning of Coatlicue. As you probably all know, she has really produced, I don't know, a whole library of books on the interpretation of what she is, and of different perspectives on Coatlicue. But then the other part starts. Dr. Gallardo, a renowned anthropologist and museum director, is shown during the day in one of the museum halls, surrounded by a large group of society ladies and journalists. He discusses the sacrifices in great detail and ends his talk with a passionate, convincing speech on the prophecy of the total restoration of the indigenous world. The anthropologist, who actually believed he was the incarnation of Quetzalcoatl's son, secretly performs these sacrifices, disguised as an Aztec chieftain, moving through a set in which there are servants and slaves, ascending long staircases to an altar, and finally arriving at the moment of sacrificing the maidens. Well, that is Dr. Gallardo descending the stairs. That is the knife. And anyway, they actually do it until they are discovered. Until he's discovered, and of course, before he kills the girl, the important girl in the film, and is obviously treated as a criminal by the police and the media. The movie version is based on a script by writer Salvador Novo, a critic of Lázaro Cárdenas' government who uses black humor to satirize indigenism. This point of view was shared by painter José Clemente Orozco, who in 1942, in his autobiography, accused indigenistas of hankering after the Aztecs' bloody past, which he equated with the modern history of totalitarianism. In 1939, he finished one of his most ambitious sets of murals, El Hospicio Cabañas, in which he dedicates scenes to human sacrifices, while in a series called Los Teules, he translates this theme into an anatomical dismembering and a spatial vertigo of the body turning in a bloodbath. The sign of death in a lighter tone suggests the phantasmatic power of the Aztecs, sort of alive in the heart of Mexico City. The latent Aztec presence, Octavio Paz, reframed in his text, as I said, criticism of the pyramid. And the important thing that I found in this text was that it could not have been written without a combination of Péret and Bataille, which I don't have time to develop, but it's part of the larger work. Paul Westheim switched between national sensitivities. In the Berlin of his youth, Westheim was dedicated to modern art and was the editor of Kunstblatt, attended courses by Wölflin and met Voringer, which had an impact on his work, and collaborated in the 1925 almanac with Carl Einstein, who in turn had written several articles for his Kunstblatt. His exile began in 1933. He left for Paris, where he worked for the alternative image of German art as opposed to Hitler's cultural politics. Once in Mexico, Westheim dedicated himself to the criticism of Mexican modern art and wrote 2 books, which I have already mentioned, Ancient Art of Mexico and Fundamental Ideas on Pre-Hispanic Art, which he dedicated mainly to the aesthetic question to fill the absence, in his own words, of a systematic exercise in that direction. I have a little piece that introduces Westheim called the Voringer-Carl Einstein connection, in which I develop why abstraction and empathy was influential for Carl Einstein in his Negerplastik, and how, in a certain way, Westheim really comes and connects with that tradition. And it would be very difficult to understand the work that he done in terms of the Pre-Columbian text he wrote without this background. Westheim's Ancient Art of Mexico is written from his ambition to produce the great narrative of the general principles that govern the pre-Hispanic world. The book highlights the author's erudition and knowledge of the various sources documenting indigenous cultures, such as the chronicles of the Indies and modern archaeology. In his approach to the aesthetic, he gives greater credence to the notions of Voringer and Einstein on non-Western art, in the symbiosis between art and religion, and a creative process that gives rise to forms that are independent from nature in the same way that the independence extends to the relationship between artifice and work, in which form acquires its own life that does not belong to its maker. There is a distance and an objectivization. According to Westheim, the production of those architectures, sculptures, vessels, and stories in images are the result of a collective mission that underpins what the West calls artistic, in a theogony and a religious system whose main principle is the contradiction, duality, clash of antagonistic forces, the eternal struggle that transforms the world into endless cycles. He also gives a very interesting description of how the artists work, how they were separated from society, nothing to do with modern ways of practicing the art craft, and he explains how they were all painted in black as a symbol of atonement, and how they were totally separated from society, and how they later become totally separated from the work they are doing. So the last part of my paper deals with the attention that Paul Westheim gave to the Aztecs, the people of Huitzilopochtli. In the penultimate chapter of his book, dedicated to Aztec sculpture, the German art historian describes Coatlicue as the monstrous monumentalized. The history of all the art, says Westheim, has only one single comparable case, Dantes Inferno. Westheim describes Coatlicue as a demon, a quadrangular monolith and architectural cyclope that shows the shape of the human body. She's not designed as a human, but as a superhuman apparition. Her face is a head with 2 snakes, with fangs and a forked tongue. Her stumps end in snake-like heads, like her hands, and instead of feet, she has a wild animal's paws. She's a human silhouette, comprising organs from various mythical animals. Faced with a work of art, the term surrealism seems appropriate to this art critic because of the procedure used, which is reminiscent of the surrealism of his time. The procedure picks up optical pieces of reality drawn from its site and is located in an ingenious creative relationship that surprises one due to the strangeness of its contrast. This process is known as dépaysement. The choice of Breton's concept, dépaysement, to approach the aesthetics of Coatlicue points to questions of meaning. The literal meaning of such a word in French is to be out of your own house, in exile, out of your land or country, and also disoriented. While at the same time, it is a compositional strategy that reorders signs and reassembles them against mimesis and coherence, and suggests a diminished consciousness to allow for hallucination, the door of imagination, in the words of Carl Einstein in his text on André Masson. Imagination reigned when the forces of religion were active as an automatic power. For Westheim, the cumulus of details in Coatlicue is a religious and philosophical concept. In his analysis of Aztec art, Westheim comments on the naturalistic art of the last time of the Aztec Empire, and in a way regrets what happened because Aztec art was grand and original when the power fantasy was daring in a barbarian way as it got lost in the meditation of life and death. Well, I have to conclude because my time is over. And I will just say that as I keep developing this research, I realize that there is this connection between Einstein and the other surrealist tradition today of this surrealism and ethnography. I also delve further on the question of how he's connected to Wöhringer and Einstein's concepts. And finally, Westheim can be translated as a house of the West, who had the mission of looking at this art as a cycle of life and destruction, and in which he had found renewal. The West that he carried in his last name did not stop him of a displacement which he followed to the last consequences in the making of his pre-Columbian aesthetics. In 1969, he returned to Berlin on a visit after an absence of over 35 years and died there of a heart attack a few days later. Péret and Westheim coincide in the notions of the strange and the foreign, of war and exile. Their ideas on the aesthetic or the analysis of structural factors of art have to do with the proximity and distance, and with crossing the opaque, the other, the masks, the invisible, visible, the painted faces of the anonymous, artifice that discovered in extreme, threatening emotions the vigor of their art, as Wöhringer and Einstein had analyzed, and obviously from another critical temperament, also Bataille. The pre-Hispanic divided the European surrealist in Mexico in many ways. That other reality required further expansion. This text seeks to be a contribution to a broader debate and how the immensity and cultural diversity of the American world transformed the relationship between art and ethnography in the field of surrealism. Thank you very much.